Welcome back after the break. We talk of life in Canada. And what I remember is that I remember of immigrant writers in Canada, whether it is Mistry, Rohinton Mistry from India or Michael Obache from Sri Lanka, whose Under the Lion's Skin was a fascinating account of mining in sometime back in Canada. And you have a cultural life which seems to be so full. I have a nephew who was opted out of staying in US in Canada because he thought the quality of life was far superior. His brother, who's an American citizen, was mighty surprised. What does this quality of life mean if we translate it in terms of art, literature, music, classical and folk? You have great sports tradition, Summer Olympics, Winter Olympics, and this painting which is right behind us. Because when I was going through the Canadian site, there was this Canadian artist Tom Thompson and the group of 7, and we had trees. And I thought this evokes Canada in a manner, the painting. So what is the state of the arts in Canada at the moment?
If you were to think of Canada and famous artists, you do think of the group of 7. But you're really beginning to see a whole different trend coming in the art scenes. And again, it's a function of our multiculturalism. So you have some fantastic Indo-Canadian art that has its genesis in India. And if you were to walk into the room next door, you'll see a very nice painting by a Chinese Canadian whose origins are in Shanghai, and it's a Tang Dynasty woman. So you'll see art has really evolved. It's no longer just about trees and lakes and the landscape. It's really about who we are as individuals in Canada now. So that's a very important change, and it's quite lively, quite vibrant. And when you talk about a great global example of that vibrancy, is Cirque du Soleil, right? Which is the premier circus act, globally now. And I'd love to see it come to India at some point in time, because people would be really just totally amazed at how good these shows are.
When we talk of art and culture, we tend to make this distinction, which is quite futile to my mind at times, between high art, classical, performing arts, and the popular culture. How does this balance work out in Canada, keeping in mind the demographic profile of Canadians, young and old, people with heritage in European arts and culture, and those immigrants from China and India and elsewhere?
Well, in what sense do you mean? How does it balance?
You do have a lot of opera, a lot of classical music, a lot of philharmonics.
In all the major cities, you have that, okay? And a lot of these troops traveled to these second-tier cities in Canada. But you'll see some world-class institutions in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. And of course, the Royal Winnipeg Ballet is globally known for its success and their performances. So we have this in Canada, and we're very fortunate to be able to expose the world to some of the things that we do. And I think one area that, from a cultural perspective, that sometimes people are really surprised when you talk about very successful comedians in the United States, or successful actors and actresses. They're Canadian, and there is, because of this sense of art and this support for it in the context of the Canadian government and also the provincial governments. It creates this ability to have a critical mass of art and culture.
If you are in Europe, this pursuit of art seems to be a pretty expensive proposition. You have to pay through your nose for a ticket to a ballet performance or a philharmonic symphony performance. How's the Canadian scene? Does the public have access to this high art because of some subsidy which government provides? Is there enough art in public domain, in public places, sculptures, etc., which get you sleeping?
Well, I think it's accessible, okay, in the sense that you can walk down streets in Canada, and it's open, it's comfortable. It's a little bit more difficult to walk down streets in Delhi and Mumbai. It's just congested and hard to do. So you see a lot of outdoor art, and people appreciate that. So the more you appreciate, the more that you have. It's accessible from a price perspective. Again, it's relative. If you went to see a show in Toronto, because most of the Broadway shows end up in Toronto, or start in Toronto, go to New York. And the price is probably, if it's not the same, it's probably a little bit less than what you would have in New York. And of course, you have a lot of performances that are free in the park. Again, I've been to Nehru Park here and seen some wonderful performances, but this, parks are everywhere in Canada and people are performing. So you do have access to this. And again, a lot of it is done on weekends and a lot of it tends to be multicultural. So you'll have Indian cultural troops performing in one park and you go down the street and you'll have Italians doing something else. So you have lots of access and the weekends are great fun. The Ottawa Jazz Festival, you have some of the best jazz musicians in the world. You have the Montreal Jazz Festival. And I know Sanjeev Bhargava has been and has brought people back here to Delhi. You have different events in Toronto. The Toronto International Film Festival is one of the premier film festivals in the world. You have the same sort of thing in Vancouver. So really, we are very, very fortunate from that perspective in Canada.
And what is the food and drink scene like? Are there any interesting Canadian wines? I remember the Canadian Club whiskey, but...
Yeah, well, Canadian wine has really evolved over time. And I just wish we had more production capacity that we could share with the world. But the wines that we have in Canada tend to be consumed in Canada because they're so good. We do have some exports to the United States and other places, but it's tough for us to get it's tough for us to get Canadian wine in general in India. Just because of how much we have, but I would put any Canadian wine up against Australian or French wines today. They are really quite good. Canadian beer is quite famous, and when you talk about Canadian food, I think you say what is Canadian food, and it's really hard sometimes to say what's Canadian. What I'd like to say today is, in Canada you can get excellent food from almost any part of the world. And I think that's what defines Canada. It goes back to our multiculturalism. So if you were in Vancouver, you'd have some of the best Chinese food that you can imagine. And it's the same thing with Indian food, because you have these chefs that have immigrated.
But would there be some dishes which you could call typically Canadian, like the Thanksgiving turkey, stuffed turkey, or mom's apple pie?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and they tend to actually come out of Quebec in terms of their history. French-Canadian sugar pie would be a classic example. There are, a variety of different cuisines that there are different dishes that come out of Quebec. But we tend to have a European approach, so meat and potatoes, now laced with lentils and a few other things that get thrown in there. So, I would say it's depending on where you are in the country. If you're in Eastern Canada and Atlantic Canada, the cuisine is around fish and shellfish and oysters and clams and mussels. And obviously lobster, which is a very popular dish in Eastern Canada. So you see all sorts of derivations as a result of that. Central Canada, where there was a large Ukrainian migration, you have pierogies is very popular, and certainly in Alberta, it's Alberta beef. There's that, people know and understand that as a brand. So you really do have quite a cross section.
Do you have any plans to bring a bit of Canada to India through a cultural center, through a food festival, through posters?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we've been discussing with the Ministry of External Affairs is doing a year of Canada and India. They did a year of India and Canada this year, and that's why we had the global PBD was in Toronto at the beginning of June. We had IFA at the end of June, and there have been a series of cultural events that have taken place in Canada over the last year. Well, we'd like to replicate something like that in 2013 for Canada here in India.
Are you happy with the degree of connectivity which exists between India, direct flights to Canada and...
Air India flies direct. I'd love to see Air Canada fly direct to India, and I know they're considering that. And I understand that the challenge, because we've had so much success in China over the last few years, you need the right equipment to be able to service the Indian market. Because we used to have a direct flight, which was an A340, but there was capacity issues with that, and so you need a 777. So once that becomes available, I think you'll see Air Canada flying direct to India.
What are the areas where in future you think Canada and India could be sort of expanding trade? Because I heard those interesting statistics, but our trade remains minuscule, $4.5 billion a year.
Yeah.
And even if it becomes 300 folds by 2015, it's not really too much in volume terms.
Not when you have two economies that are $1 trillion each. And this isn't meant as an excuse, but a lot of product that comes to India from Canada goes through third markets, so it doesn't get captured in the statistics. So 8 out of every
What third countries it would go to? For instance, the
Well, a lot of product that comes to India might be shipped out of the United States. So the U.S. would capture those numbers as opposed to India. So we have 600 engines on airplanes in India that were manufactured in Montreal. So those engines will go to Europe or they'd go to the U.S. before they'd actually end up in India. 8 out of every 10 diamonds out of the big mine in the Northwest Territories ends up in Surat, in Gujarat. But those diamonds all go through Antwerp first. So we don't capture those numbers. There's a lot of gold that comes from Canada that ends up in India. We don't capture those numbers. So it's not an excuse, because I have a very well-defined goal from the Prime Minister, which is to raise our bilateral trading relationship threefold in the next 5 years, or less than 5 years now. So, but we have to understand that we do an awful lot of trade with India, but it's just not recorded.
When I'm going through these papers, the Tatas, the Mahindras, the Reva, the electrical cars seem to be the majors there. But none of our IT majors seems to be.
Well, that's not true. I mean, you have Infosys, Wipro, TCS are all in Canada. Another company, I was just in Mumbai for the World Economic Forum, and I sat beside a fellow, Sunderland, who is from the southern part of India. They have 2,000 employees in Canada right now. So we do have a lot of the information technology companies active. Birla has bought a BPO operation based in Canada. When you take a look at our investment, what I would say is that Indian investment into Canada is larger than Canadian investment into India, but that's changing as well.
What would be the Canadian companies that would be looking forward to a better, larger partnership in India in coming years?
Well, I mean, we already have invested in India. McCain's we talked about, Bombardier we've talked about, SNC we've talked about. All 5 of the Canadian banks are invested in India. We've got 25 automotive parts manufacturers invested in India. So we do have a lot of companies that are involved, and we will get more, because when I talk to Canadians who want to do business in India, I say it's impossible to do business remotely with India. You have to be able to establish a presence, and you have to be able to develop the right type of collaboration. We talked about our sophisticated technology. Well, you can't bring that sophisticated technology into this market and expect to sell it. You have to adapt it to the realities of the market. And that's why you have to have a very good and very capable Indian partner to do that. And so that's what we do. We are encouraging that relationship to be much more collaborative in their approach.
While Indians might find it difficult to travel to Canada as tourists, what about the Canadians coming to India for tourists, or combining India as an itinerary on their...
I mean, again, well, we're at this time of year where we are seeing more and more Canadians coming. India well, you have the natural Indo-Canadian tourism link. So there'll be lots of Canadians of Indian origin who are coming back at this time of year for weddings and the such like. But what you're seeing now, because of the importance that the Canadian government is placing on India, you have a lot of Canadians who aren't of Indian origin coming to India to see what's going on here. And I mean for vacation purposes. So it's, and the problem, if I was to make a point, is I find that it's quite expensive at this time of year to travel in India. So if you're willing to travel, when it gets a bit hotter, you can get some pretty good deals, but right now it's expensive.
So perhaps we have to look for a time when the tickets are cheaper and the pleasures are greater here in India.
That's right.
So we look forward to more and more Canadians visiting India, and these ties between India and Canada getting reinforced, flourishing, and mutually beneficial. It's been very fascinating to have you on the show, Your Excellency. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much.
That's all we have for this week. Thanks for watching Globe Watch. Next week we'll be back again with another country, and do hope that you will be back with us. If you want to get in touch with us, you can contact us on globewatch@lstv@gmail.com. Goodbye till next week.